91 miles an hour was the gust that hit Fort Wayne, Indiana that night. It came on June 29th, 2012, on the edge of a monster. That storm crossed 10 states before dawn and never once slowed down. More than 4 million American homes went dark before the sun came up. 13 people died under falling trees, and that was the smaller number. In the powerless days after, in heat that would not break, more died. At least 34 more Americans died quietly, indoors, many of them alone. Tonight, a version of that exact setup is locking over the eastern United States. So here is the one question that truly matters this holiday weekend. If a storm kills the power over one of these cities, what happens? Do the streets from Chicago to Washington live through June 2012 again? Subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The lid that refuses to lift off the country. 10 days ago, the eastern United States looked completely ordinary for early summer. Warm, humid, a few afternoon storms, nothing that would make anyone look up. That is how the setups that actually kill people tend to arrive. They do not announce themselves with a screaming red map and a countdown clock. They assemble quietly, one piece at a time, until only a trigger is missing. What changed is not the weather you can see out of your kitchen window. It is the shape of the air itself, 5 and 6 miles above your head. A ridge of high pressure has built over the middle of the country and stopped moving. Picture a dome of hot sinking air, a lid clamped over half a continent. Under that lid, the air that should rise and cool gets forced back down instead, so it just sits there and bakes, hotter and heavier with every passing day. Think of it as a pressure cooker lid holding heat in that wants to escape. That single image is going to matter more and more as this story unfolds. Meteorologists gauge the strength of that dome by how high the pressure surfaces bulge upward. You do not need the jargon to understand the danger sitting over these cities. The values the forecast models keep printing are ones you see only a few times each summer. This is a strong one, and it is parked over the most crowded half of the country. Here is what that lid means down where you actually live and breathe. Afternoon highs near 103 degrees in Washington and around 104 in Philadelphia. The heat index, the number your skin actually fights, is climbing toward 115. Chicago, St. Louis, New York and Boston all sit inside the same brutal footprint. That is why more than 165 million people fall under the heat warnings tonight. Hold that number in your head, because it comes back later with real teeth. And I have to be honest with you about one thing right at the start. 103 degrees in July is dangerous, but on its own it is not historic. Phoenix would barely blink at a number like that in the desert southwest. So the afternoon high is not really the reason to give this weekend your attention. The reason is a quieter number hiding at the very bottom of the forecast. It is the same number that turned an ordinary storm into a massacre in 2012. We are going to reach that number, and it will change how you read every heat forecast. And here is the piece that turns a hot weekend into a real threat. This dome is not a guess that leaves after the holiday. The Climate Prediction Center has leaned toward above normal heat continuing past the 4th. In plain terms, this lid looks like it wants to stay a while. Remember how heat actually kills, through accumulation, night after night, with no reset. A single 100-degree afternoon is survivable for very nearly everyone beneath it. A long stack of them, with hot nights between, is a different animal. That stack is the exact profile of the events that fill morgues. So when a cheerful forecaster says hot through the weekend, hear the duration. The duration is not a footnote to the danger this weekend. The duration is the danger, and it is quietly building right now. Think again about that pressure cooker lid holding all that heat down. Every day the sun pours another load of energy beneath it, and almost none of that energy escapes back out overnight anymore. I want you to hold that trapped energy in mind as we go. It powers the heat that threatens bodies in the dense city cores, and it powers the storms that ride the northern rim of the dome. One reservoir of heat is feeding two very different kinds of danger. The forecasters are not watching one clock over this holiday weekend. They are watching two, and both of them are winding tighter tonight. That is what makes this setup worth an entire hour of your evening. Not the afternoon number, but the machine quietly assembling behind it. Let me anchor this in places you can actually picture tonight. In St. Louis, the feels-like number is forecast near 115. In the Ohio Valley, the nights barely dip out of the upper 70s. The Climate Prediction Center's 6 to 10 day outlook keeps the heat well above normal. So this is not a one-day spike that a cold front erases. It is a settled pattern that intends to overstay the holiday. And every extra day under the lid raises the floor beneath the next. That rising floor is the quiet arithmetic of a heat disaster. It is why the third and fourth days are worse than the first. The bodies that cope on day 1 begin to fail by day 4. There is a reason this dome refuses to move off the map. The jet stream, the river of wind that steers our weather, has buckled far north. That leaves the ridge sitting underneath it like a boulder in a stream. Passing weather systems get shoved around it instead of through it. So the fronts that would normally break a heat wave never arrive. The pattern is locked, and a locked pattern is what turns days into a siege. That is the difference between a hot spell and a dangerous one. A hot spell passes in a day or two and is forgotten. A siege settles in, and the heat compounds until something finally breaks. This weekend has the fingerprints of a siege, not a spell. But first you have to see what is riding in on the edge of this thing. Part 2. The map where 1 in 2 Americans is sweating tonight. Let me make that giant number mean something, because otherwise it is just noise. 165 million people is close to 1 out of every 2 Americans. All of them are awake tonight under the very same dome of trapped heat. It stretches from the open plains all the way east to the Atlantic coast. It covers the corn country of Iowa, the river valleys of the Ohio, the Northeast. That includes the crowded chain of cities from Washington up through Philadelphia and into New England. A city is not some neutral place to be during a heat wave like this one. Concrete, asphalt, brick and steel soak up the sun all day long. Then they release that stored heat slowly, all through the night, like a warm stone. So a dense urban core can run far hotter than the leafy suburbs beside it. Scientists call this the urban heat island, and it decides who lives and who does not. It is the reason the same heat wave is a nuisance in one town, and it is a genuine killer in a denser town nearby. On the worst nights, the gap between city core and green suburb runs into double digits. The suburb might cool to a survivable 72 degrees by 4 in the morning. The dense neighbourhood 10 miles away never drops below the middle 80s at all. Same heat wave, same city on the map, 2 completely different outcomes for the people inside. Now think about who actually lives in the hottest, most paved parts of these cities. Heat is not a random killer that strikes everyone under the dome equally. It hunts the same people every single time it comes to an American city. It takes the elderly, and especially the elderly who live entirely alone. It takes people with heart conditions, because heat puts a crushing load on the heart. It takes people who cannot afford to run the one air conditioner they own. In every major heat disaster on record, the dead cluster in exactly those groups. Keep picturing those specific people, because the whole question of this weekend turns on them. Stack it all together, and the danger is already there before a storm even forms. Take 165 million people, concentrate the most fragile into hot concrete cores, hold the heat over them for days with no real overnight relief at all. You have built a heat disaster that needs no storm, no wind, nothing more. The heat alone is a live and serious threat this weekend, whatever the sky decides. But there is a second clock running, and it runs along the top of this map. Let me stay on that map of concrete for one more moment. The forecast high you hear on the news is a single city-wide number, but heat does not kill a city evenly. All at once, everywhere, it kills block by block, and the deadliest blocks are the poorest. They are the oldest, the most paved, and the least shaded blocks. And the people living on them often cannot simply get in a car. They cannot just drive to a cooler place and wait it out. Many do not own a car, and many cannot afford the gas. Many are too frail or too sick to leave home at all. So the danger is not only the heat sitting over the map, it is the heat meeting the people least able to escape it. Picture an older woman on a high floor of an old building. The heat has been climbing in her rooms for 3 straight days. Her one window unit strains, and she rations it against the bill. At night, the walls give back the heat they soaked up by day. That is the real face of a heat disaster in an American city. It is quiet, it is indoors, and it is almost always alone. Keep her in your mind, because this whole story returns to her. She is who the number at the bottom of the forecast is about. She is who lives or dies depending on the wire to her building. And that wire brings us to the second clock over this map. Put real cities to that abstract map for a moment. Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston sit in one dense line. Tens of millions of people live packed along that single corridor. Add Chicago and St. Louis to the west, and the number climbs higher. These are not empty acres where heat passes harmlessly overhead. They are the most crowded blocks of concrete in the country. And crowded concrete is precisely what holds the heat after dark. So the map of the dome is also a map of exposure. The more people under the hottest part, the higher the stakes climb. That is why this particular footprint worries forecasters more than most. Let me name exactly who the heat comes for first. It comes for adults over 65 whose bodies regulate heat poorly. It comes for infants and the very young for the same reason. It comes for people on common medications that blunt the body's cooling. Certain heart and blood pressure drugs quietly impair how you shed heat. So a person can be doing everything right and still be at risk. It comes for outdoor workers and for anyone without reliable cooling at home. And it comes hardest for those who check all of those boxes at once. That is not a rare, unlucky few in these cities. That is millions of people spread through every neighbourhood under this dome. To understand why forecasters keep staring at that northern edge, you need a strange phrase. Part 3. The ring of fire almost nobody thinks to look up at. The ring of fire here has nothing to do with volcanoes or the Pacific. It is what forecasters call the northern edge of a big summer heat dome. Go back to that lid of high pressure, that dome of hot sinking air again. Right at its rim, a fast river of wind sets up, flowing west to east. That river works exactly like a conveyor belt running along the top of the dome. Storms that fire over the plains get caught on that belt and carried for hours. They feed the whole way on the hot, unstable air sitting right at the boundary. So the centre of the dome stays hot and dry, cloudless and still and baking. But that rim, that ring around the top of the heat, is where the violence lives. The heat and the storms are not two separate stories that happen to sit near each other. They are the same machine, viewed from two different and dangerous sides. And there is a cruel logic to exactly where that ring aims its worst weather. The storms track along the boundary between the trapped heat and the cooler air north. That boundary runs right along the top tier of the biggest, most crowded cities, so the same pattern baking those millions by day steers the night's violence toward them. It is not a coincidence that these storms so often end up over the cities. It is built into the physics of where the dome's deadly edge falls. Here is what that machine is doing right now, and here I have to be careful. This is exactly the kind of moment where fear could be sold to you cheaply. So listen closely to the honest state of the storm forecast tonight, without any drama. The NOAA Storm Prediction Center has drawn a broad marginal risk on the northern flank. Marginal is the lowest of the 5 severe categories, the very first rung of 5. Inside it sits a slightly higher slight risk, up over the northern plains. The main threats named are damaging straight-line winds and large, dangerous hail. That is the whole honest picture tonight, marginal to slight, the bottom of the ladder. I am telling you that flatly, with no music, because the gap between forecast and fear matters. The Storm Prediction Center has not, as of tonight, forecasted Derecho at all. It has not drawn a high-end wind threat over the mid-Atlantic cities. What it has drawn is a routine summer wind threat for now. It rides the edge of a savage and stationary heat dome. Those are very different things, and the difference is the whole reason for honesty here. So why do professional forecasters keep one eye on this even at marginal? Because the ingredients for a windstorm do not work like a simple light switch. They work like a dial, and different pieces can sit at very different settings. And the one piece pinned to the very top of the dial is the heat. When that much heat energy is stacked low in the atmosphere, storms can overperform badly. It does not take a 600-mile monster to devastate a single American city. It takes one strong cluster over one metro at the wrong hour, dropping the lines. Let me be very clear about what I am not saying tonight. I am not saying a monster storm is barreling toward these cities. The honest forecast is modest, and I will keep repeating that plainly. The marginal risk means most places see nothing worse than ordinary storms. A few could turn briefly strong, with gusty wind and heavy rain. That is the realistic base case for this holiday weekend right now. But the dial can move, and the fuel for it is extreme. Think of the heat as a room slowly filling with gasoline vapor. Most days there is no spark, and nothing ever happens at all. The gasoline just sits there, harmless, and then it quietly disperses. But the more vapor in the room, the worse any spark becomes. This weekend the room is as full of vapor as it gets. So the professionals watch, not because a blast is likely tonight. They watch because the consequences, if one came, would be severe. And they watch because this exact room has exploded here before. It exploded in 2012, and it exploded again in 2020. Both times the morning looked far calmer than the evening turned out. That is the humility this setup demands, even at a low risk. Hold that idea of vapor in a room as we go back. Because in 2012, the spark found the room at its fullest, and the explosion that followed rewrote how this country plans for heat. Here is how the warning would actually reach you this weekend. If storms start organising, the centre issues a mesoscale discussion first. That is a short note flagging a threat that is sharpening fast. A severe thunderstorm watch can follow within an hour or two. Then, closer in, the warnings fire for individual counties in the path. The whole ladder can climb in the span of a single evening. That is the speed you are watching for on the northern rim. Not a monster on the morning map, but a sharpening after dark. So if a watch goes up near these cities tonight, pay attention. That is the dial turning, in real time, towards something worse. To understand why that combination is so lethal, you have to watch it actually happen. Part 4. The afternoon, a summer storm simply refused to die. It began in the early afternoon up near where Iowa runs into Illinois. It started as a genuinely unremarkable knot of ordinary summer thunderstorms over the fields. On almost any other day, those storms rise, pour out rain, and collapse by evening. Nobody would ever have remembered them, or given them a name, or feared them. But that day, the air ahead of them held a staggering amount of raw energy. A severe heatwave was already baking the Midwest, with temperatures deep into the hundreds. That superheated air was a reservoir of fuel just waiting for something to tap it, so the storms did not weaken and die the way they almost always do. They fed on that heat instead, and then they kept right on feeding. What happened next still humbles the scientists who spend whole careers studying these storms. As the storms dumped rain, they dragged a rush of cold air toward the ground. That cold air hit the surface and spread outward in every direction at once. On a normal day, that pool of cold air would choke the storms off completely. But with this much heat ahead of them, the cold air became a plough instead. It shoved under the hot air and forced it violently upward into brand new storms. The system began building its own leading edge and then racing along it eastward. The middle of the line bulged forward, curved out ahead like an archer's drawn bow. Forecasters call that shape a bow echo, and it is the signature of serious wind. The whole thing charged east at the speed of highway traffic, and it strengthened. It threw down gusts of 70, then 80, and in places over 90 miles an hour. That is exactly what earns a storm the strange Spanish name we will unpack later. Stephen Corfidi, a meteorologist at the Storm Prediction Center, helped write its modern definition. A tornado, by contrast, is rotation, a narrow twisting drill that tears one street apart. A derecho is the opposite thing entirely, a straight line hammer dozens of miles wide. Think of a tornado as a corkscrew and a derecho as a bulldozer blade. The corkscrew wrecks one house. The bulldozer levels everything in a single long push. This particular bulldozer would end up crossing roughly 10 states before it was finished. By evening, it was tearing through Indiana and Ohio with terrifying, relentless force. Fort Wayne, Indiana clocked that 91-mile-an-hour gust I opened with tonight. Trees that had stood 100 years came down all at once, everywhere. Every tree that fell across a power line dropped another neighborhood into hot darkness. The outage map spread east almost as fast as the storm itself, a chasing shadow. By nightfall, millions across the Midwest had already lost power, and it kept moving. It was aimed now at the most crowded corridor in the entire United States, and that corridor was suffering under the very worst heat of the whole event. I want you to feel the speed of this thing, because speed killed. This was not a slow system you could track all afternoon. It ran from the Midwest to the Atlantic in about 12 hours. That is a wall of destruction moving at highway speed for half a day. A hurricane gives you days of warning to prepare and to leave. A winter storm gives you days as well, mapped out in advance. This gave the mid-Atlantic almost nothing once it became a true monster. For most of its life, it moved faster than the certainty about it. By the time forecasters were sure, it was nearly at the door. That combination is what makes this species of storm so deadly. Immense power, highway speed, and almost no usable lead time at all. Now remember the bulldozer image, the straight-line hammer dozens of miles wide. Picture that blade running 800 miles without lifting off the ground. Everything in the path takes the hit at nearly the same moment, and behind the blade, the shadow of darkened homes only grows. That shadow was already millions of homes wide by nightfall. It was still spreading east as families were going to bed. None of them knew the wind was minutes from their windows. None of them knew the power was about to vanish for days. And none of them knew the heat would be the thing that hunted them. Follow the blade east across Ohio and into the mountains. In town after town, the story was the same brutal sequence. A raw, then wind, then the crash of falling hardwood everywhere. West Virginia took a savage hit as the line kept its strength. Crossing the mountains usually weakens these systems, but this one held. It came down the far slopes, still throwing damaging, house-shaking wind. And ahead of it lay the crowded suburbs of the capital region. Millions of people there had no idea what was already coming. They were asleep in the heat with their windows thrown open. The blade was minutes away, and it had not weakened at all. Meteorologists later called it a super derecho, and the name fits. Its damaging wind swath ran hundreds of miles without a real break. It stayed organised far longer than these systems normally managed to. That endurance is what carried it all the way to the coast. Most storm complexes weaken and scatter within an hour or two. This one held its shape and its violence for most of a day. So it did not just clip one region and move on. It raked a huge slice of the country in a single pass. That is why it is remembered as one of the most destructive of its kind. Stay with me, because what happened when it reached the capital changed everything. Part 5. The night the capital of the country lost its lights. It came into the Washington and Baltimore area late, near 10 and 11 at night. It arrived over a region that had just endured one of its hottest days ever. Washington had touched around 104 degrees under the sun that very afternoon. People had gone to bed, or tried to, in thick, motionless, punishing heat. Many had thrown their windows open, desperate for even the faintest breath of moving air. Then, with almost no warning at all, the wind arrived at those open windows. Gusts across the suburbs hit 60, then 70, and in spots near 80 miles an hour. This is a region packed with old, tall, heavy hardwood trees along every street. That combination is a catastrophe playing out in slow, splintering, terrifying motion. Trees came down across whole neighborhoods at the very same moment, block after block. They fell onto houses while entire families were fast asleep in their beds. They fell across the roads that ambulances and fire trucks would soon need badly. And they fell, by the thousands, across the power lines feeding the capital region. Within minutes, well over 1 million customers across the area lost all power, had everything already dark behind the storm, and the total pushed past 4 million homes. Picture the actual scene for 1 second, because the raw number can go abstract fast. Transformers were failing in bright blue-green flashes that lit the underside of the clouds. Century-old oaks were snapping whole and crashing down across cars and roofs and streets. Crews that tried to respond found their own routes blocked by the fallen trees. Traffic signals across entire counties went dark at once, turning intersections into hazards. And in hundreds of thousands of bedrooms, the air conditioning simply stopped. People woke to the wind, and then to a silence that was somehow far worse. That silence was the sound of the real disaster quietly beginning in the dark. Now here is the exact hinge the whole night turns on, so hold it tight. It was nearly midnight, and the temperature outside was still up in the 80s. A severe heatwave was locked in place, and going absolutely nowhere for days. And the air conditioning had just died for well over 1 million households at once. The storm itself, the loud part, was essentially over within a single hour. It roared out over the Atlantic before dawn and fell completely apart over the water. If the story ended right there, it would be a bad night and a big clean-up. 13 tragic deaths, a hard week, and then a slow return to normal life. But the story did not end there, and this is what I need you to understand. The wind was only ever the opening act of this particular disaster. Hold on the hinge of that midnight with me for a moment. The loud disaster was over, and the quiet one had just begun. Every retelling loves the wind, the flashes, the falling trees, the drama. Almost none of them follow the story into the powerless days after. That is the exact place where this disaster did its real work. Because a shattered grid does not come back with a single switch. The trees have to be cleared, the lines rebuilt, span by span, and all of it happens in the same heat that makes it urgent. Picture the crews in that heat, chainsaws going, poles going back up. Picture the neighbourhoods behind them, still dark, waiting their turn for days. Picture the woman on the high floor, her window unit silent now. The temperature in her rooms climbs a little higher every afternoon, and it never fully falls back down through the sweltering nights. This is the part the cameras missed, and the headlines skipped entirely. It was not dramatic, so it did not lead the evening news, but it is where the dying quietly happened, day after day. Remember that the wind killed 13 people on that first night. Remember that the heat that followed killed far more than that, and remember that almost no one was watching when it did. That gap between the loud threat and the quiet one is everything. It is the gap that this whole weekend forces us to face. There was a second theft that night beyond the air conditioning. In Northern Virginia, the storm knocked out the 911 system. For days, in a heat emergency, calls for help would not connect. Reviews later found the failure crippled emergency calling for millions of people. Picture that for the woman on the high floor once more. Her cooling is gone, and now her lifeline is gone too. If the heat turns on her, she cannot even call out. That is the compounding failure that makes these nights so lethal. The storm does not only take the machine that cools you, sometimes it takes the phone call that would have saved you. Understand why the capital region was so uniquely exposed that night. This is one of the most heavily treed metro areas in the country. Tall old hardwoods line the streets and tower over the power lines. On a still summer night, that canopy is a gift and a shade. Under 80-mile-an-hour wind, it becomes thousands of falling, battering rams. Each tree that came down took a span of power line with it, and each fallen line meant a crew, by hand, in the heat, for days. That is why an hour of wind became a week without power. The same trees that make the region beautiful made it fragile, and fragility, on the wrong night, is another word for danger. The heat that followed was the main event, and it was just getting started. Part 6. The forecast that never saw the monster coming. Before we follow that heat into the deadly days after, one piece gets left out. It is the part of the 2012 story almost every retelling quietly drops. Nobody saw it coming, not clearly, and not with enough time to truly act. On the morning of June 29th, the forecast did not describe the monster ahead. The Storm Prediction Centre outlooks that morning did carry a risk of severe storms. This was a hot, unstable, loaded setup, and forecasters knew strong storms were possible. But the guidance did not capture the intensity, the organisation, or the sheer reach. The storm intensified far faster than the models expected it to that day. It travelled much further than almost anyone would have drawn at first light. As it revealed itself, the risk areas had to be upgraded in real time, but by then the storm was already writing its own forecast on the ground. I am not telling you this to embarrass anyone at those agencies. Not at all. Forecasting a Derecho a full day out is a genuinely hard, unsolved problem. So why is forecasting one of these a genuinely hard problem to solve? Because a Derecho is an emergent, self-made thing born in real time. It is not sitting in the morning data waiting quietly to be spotted. It is born from storms that have not even formed yet at dawn. Small shifts in where the first storms fire change absolutely everything downstream. The same near miss happened again on August 10th, 2020, in Iowa. That morning the Storm Prediction Centre barely had the area in any risk. The storms were expected to weaken and fade as they moved southeast toward Nebraska. Instead, they exploded, and that Derecho became the costliest thunderstorm in United States history. It caused about $11 billion in damage across the Midwest that day. It carried winds up to 140 miles an hour near Cedar Rapids. Alan Curtis, a National Weather Service meteorologist in Des Moines, explained the brutal timing. He noted the August hit flattened tall summer crops that spring would have spared. 2 derechos, 8 years apart, and both of them outran the morning forecast badly. So hold both of these facts at once, because you truly need them both. 1. Tonight's outlook is genuinely modest, and a modest outcome is by far most likely. 2. The one time it mattered most, a modest outlook was catastrophically wrong. That is precisely why the professionals never fully relax on a hot, loaded setup. Most of the time, a marginal risk is exactly and only what it says. Ring of fire setups like this happen many times over a single American summer. Only very rarely does one of them detonate into a 2012. If I told you this weekend was probably a repeat, I would be lying with numbers. But the reason we watch at all is that here, it is not impossible. Let me sit with the 2020 case for one more moment. That Iowa derecho became the costliest thunderstorm disaster in United States history. It caused about $11 billion in damage across the Midwest. It flattened millions of acres of corn and soybeans in a morning. It knocked out power to hundreds of thousands for days and weeks. Cedar Rapids lost nearly 70% of its tree canopy that day. Winds there reached an astonishing 140 miles an hour. 4 people died, and 20 million were touched by the winds. And the whole thing travelled 770 miles in 14 hours. Yet that very morning, the outlook barely had the area in any risk. Forecasters expected the storms to weaken and fade toward Nebraska instead. They did the opposite, exploding into the strongest derecho on record. Alan Curtis, a National Weather Service meteorologist, later explained the cruel timing. The August hit caught crops at full height, when wind does most harm. 2 summers, 2012 and 2020, and 2 forecasts caught off guard. I am not telling you this to frighten you about tonight. Tonight's outlook is modest, and modest is the most likely outcome. I am telling you so you understand why the pros never fully relax. A loaded atmosphere can build its own monster faster than the models see. That is the humble truth behind every quiet marginal risk in summer, and it is the reason a low number is not the same as nothing. Let me give the base rate its honest due one more time. These ring of fire setups form many times over a single summer. The vast majority produce nothing worse than a few downed limbs. A scattered outage here, a hard rain there, and it is over by dinner. Only a small handful ever organise into something truly dangerous. Fewer still become a 2012 or a 2020. So the honest expectation for any one setup is a quiet one. That is true tonight, and I want that on the record. The reason we still watch is not that disaster is likely, it is that the rare disaster is so severe it demands respect. Watch how the 2020 morning slipped past the forecasters. The storms first hit the Omaha area with 60 and 70 mile an hour wind. Even that knocked out power to tens of thousands right away. Forecasters still expected the line to fade as it pushed on. Instead, by mid-morning, they had to upgrade the risk in a hurry. The storms had crossed into hotter, more unstable air and exploded. By the time the outlook caught up, the damage was underway. That is the same pattern that fooled the pros in 2012. A modest morning gave almost no hint of the afternoon to come. Now let me take you into the heat, where the real dying actually happened. Part 7. The killer that waited until the cameras left. The morning after the derecho, the story quietly left the news entirely. The wind was gone, the sky was clear, and the cameras moved on. That is the exact moment the real disaster began to do its work. More than 4 million homes still sat without any power at all. and the temperature was climbing right back up toward 100 degrees. Here is the mechanism, and I want you to follow it very slowly. A healthy body sheds heat in two main and reliable ways. It sweats, and the evaporation of that sweat carries heat away from you, and it pushes warm blood toward the skin to radiate heat outward. Think of your body as a radiator that dumps heat into cooler air. Both systems work well, but only if the surroundings are cooler than you. When the air is near body temperature and humid, both systems start failing. The heat stops leaving, and your core temperature begins its slow, dangerous rise. That is the road to heat exhaustion, and then to full heat stroke. Heat stroke arrives when the core climbs past about 104 degrees. The body's ability to regulate itself simply breaks down at that point. Organs begin to fail, and without fast cooling, a person dies. But the lethal version is rarely one dramatic collapse in the street. It is the slow accumulation of strain over days, with no nighttime relief. For a young person with working air conditioning, all of this is uncomfortable. For an 80-year-old with a weak heart and no power, it is a trap. Stay with me, because that trap is exactly what closed across the mid-Atlantic. The people who died in the days after were not killed by anything dramatic. They were found later, alone, inside their own hot, silent, powerless homes. Many were elderly, many lived alone, and many had lost their only cooling. The official government review, the National Weather Service Assessment, laid it bare. The direct storm deaths, from falling trees and debris, numbered around 13. The heat-related deaths in the powerless aftermath added at least 34 more. Let that comparison sit with you for a long, uncomfortable second. More people died from losing power in the heat than from the storm itself. And there was a second failure that should keep every planner awake at night. In Northern Virginia, the Derecho knocked out the 911 emergency call system. For days, in a heat emergency, the most vulnerable could not reliably call for help. Reviews later found the outage crippled emergency calling for more than 2 million people. So the storm did not only steal the air conditioning from these neighborhoods. In places, it also stole the lifeline you use when the heat turns deadly. Now walk the days that followed with me, because the timeline is the argument. June 30th dawned clear and hot over a region still largely without power. Utilities sent mutual aid crews from across the country toward the shattered grid. But a grid broken tree by tree cannot be rebuilt in a single day. July 1st came, and July 2nd, and still huge numbers had no power. Cities scrambled to open cooling centres as fast as they possibly could. But a cooling centre only helps the people who can actually reach it. That leaves out the homebound elderly, the exact people the heat hunts first. By the 4th of July, some hard-hit areas were still dark and still baking. Restoration would stretch beyond a week in the very worst pockets of damage. Every one of those days added more strain to bodies that could not escape. This is the part almost no retelling includes, because it is not cinematic, it is just a slow, quiet grind of heat against the human body, and that grind is where most of the actual dying quietly took place. Let me walk the aftermath a little more slowly, because timing is everything. June 30th was the first full day of the powerless heat. Crews were still arriving as the temperature climbed back toward 100. July 1st came, and vast numbers of homes were still dark. July 2nd came, and the heat had not broken for a moment. Cities threw open cooling centres as fast as they possibly could. But a cooling centre only saves the person who can reach it. The homebound elderly could not walk there, could not drive there, could not leave. The very people the heat hunts hardest were the ones it could not help. By the 4th of July, some neighbourhoods were still without power entirely. In the worst pockets, The lights stayed off for more than a week. Every extra day added strain to bodies that could not shed the heat, and most of those bodies belonged to people already living alone. This is why the death toll climbed long after the storm was gone. It climbed in silence, in locked rooms, out of everyone's sight. It is also why that toll is almost certainly an undercount. When a frail heart stops in the heat, the certificate blames the heart. It rarely names the heat that pushed that heart past its limit. So the 34 is a flaw, and the true number ran higher. Remember that as we finally reach the number I keep promising you. It is the number that decided who lived and who did not. The medical toll ran deeper than the death certificates ever showed. Hospitals across the region ran for days on backup generators. People who depend on oxygen machines at home suddenly had none. People on dialysis could not reach the clinics that keep them alive. Refrigerated medicines, like insulin, spoiled quietly in warm, dark kitchens. Each of those is a hidden way the outage reached into a body. Few of them were ever counted as storm deaths at all. That is another reason the true toll ran higher than reported. The wind broke the grid, and the broken grid broke the sick. And almost none of it happened where a camera could see. Hold that image, because it is about to explain the number I promised you. Part 8. What the heat is really doing inside a body. Let me stay inside the body a little longer, because the science earns the dread. Remember the radiator image, your body dumping heat into the air around you. That radiator only works when the surrounding air is cooler than your skin. During the day, in this heat, the air barely gives your body a break. So the whole burden of survival shifts onto the hours after dark. The overnight cool down is when your overworked heart finally gets to slow down. It is when a house without air conditioning finally sheds its stored heat. It is the reset that lets a body start the next day lower. When the night refuses to cool, that reset simply never happens at all. The strain never lifts, and it compounds night over night like unpaid debt. Now here is the part that makes heat such a quiet, underestimated killer. The progression is far slower and stranger than most people ever imagine it. It rarely looks like a dramatic collapse that someone nearby would notice fast. In the elderly, it often looks like growing confusion, weakness, and disorientation. That can be mistaken for simply being tired, right up until it is fatal. A person in the early stages may not grasp what is happening to them. And if they live alone, no one else is there to notice either. That is how people die in their own homes during an American heatwave. It is not that the danger was invisible to everyone watching from outside. It is that the person in danger was alone, and the signs stayed subtle. There is one more thing you must understand about the true death toll here. Heat deaths are almost always undercounted in nearly every event on record. When an elderly person with heart disease dies, the certificate lists the heart. It rarely lists the heat that pushed that stressed heart over the edge. So the official heat death numbers are a floor, never a ceiling. Researchers who study this agree the real toll runs higher than reported. When I say 34 died in the heat after 2012, believe more did. Heat kills more Americans in a typical year than any other weather. Not tornadoes, not floods, not hurricanes, not lightning, but the quiet heat. It earns that grim title precisely because it works indoors and half hidden. Sociologist Eric Klinenberg proved this after Chicago's catastrophic heatwave in 1995. That heatwave killed 739 people over just a few days. Klinenberg called his study a social autopsy of the whole disaster. His finding was blunt, and it still holds true for this weekend. The people who died were overwhelmingly the isolated, the elderly, the alone. They died behind locked doors and sealed windows, out of everyone's sight. Many had no air conditioning, and many more feared the electric bill. So living alone, in his words, too often became dying alone. Keep Klinenberg's finding close, because it points straight at the real number. Let me push the science one more step, because it earns the dread. Heat stroke is not the only way the heat takes a life. Long before that, the heat quietly overloads a stressed and aging heart. To cool you, the body pushes blood outward toward the skin. That forces the heart to work harder, hour after hour, for days. For a weak heart, that sustained load is the real danger here. It is why most heat deaths are recorded as cardiac events instead. The heat is the cause, but the heart is what finally stops. Return to the radiator image, your body dumping heat into the air. In this heat, during the day, that radiator has almost nowhere to dump, so it leans entirely on the night to catch back up. And when the night stays hot, the radiator simply never catches up. The single most protective thing in that whole chain is the air conditioner. It is the one machine that gives the radiator somewhere to dump. Take it away, and the oldest and sickest bodies begin to fail. That is why a power cut in this heat is not an inconvenience. It is the removal of the one intervention that keeps people alive. Klinenberg saw this plainly in Chicago in 1995, house by house. The homes with working air conditioning lived, and many without it did not. Hold that grim contrast, because it is the whole game this weekend. The wire to the air conditioner is the line between the two. There is a simple way to feel why humidity makes it worse. Sweat only cools you when it can evaporate off your skin. In dry desert heat, it evaporates fast, and the body copes. In thick eastern humidity, the sweat just sits there instead. The body's main cooling system stalls exactly when it is needed most. That is why the same temperature feels far deadlier in the east. And this weekend pairs high heat with heavy tropical humidity, so the feels like number climbs well past the actual air temperature. For a straining heart, that gap is the difference that kills. Remember it whenever you hear only the plain afternoon high. There is a final cruel turn in how the body fails here. As a person dehydrates, the body starts to ration its sweat, but sweat is the main way it was cooling itself at all. So the one defense left begins to shut down under the strain. Core temperature then climbs faster, and the spiral tightens quickly. This is why heat can turn from bearable to deadly so suddenly. A person feels merely tired, and then, within hours, they do not. For someone alone, there is no one to catch that turn. That is the quiet trap the number at the bottom describes. The one hiding at the very bottom of this weekend's forecast. Part 9. The number hiding at the bottom of the forecast. Here is the number I promised you back at the very start. It is not the frightening 104 on the afternoon graphic. It is the overnight low, the nighttime temperature, quietly printed underneath. In heat disasters, again and again, the night does the actual killing. We touched on why, but now let me make it fully concrete for you. Your body can survive a brutal afternoon if it truly recovers at night. The cool down after dark is when all of that accumulated strain resets. It is when the heart slows and the house finally sheds its heat. When the overnight low stays high, that entire recovery process never happens. The heat just compounds, night over night, until the most fragile body fails. This is the single most consistent finding in the whole science of heat mortality. The events that kill in large numbers are the ones where nights stay hot. So what is the threshold, the value that forecasters actually watch closely? There is no single magic line where some switch suddenly flips over. But researchers and the National Weather Service watch one zone very carefully. They worry when overnight lows fail to drop below roughly 80 degrees. They worry most when that happens for several nights in a row. 80 degrees at night, held for days, in a dense city, is the fingerprint. It is the fingerprint of the deadliest heat events this country produces. And that is precisely what this weekend's forecast shows in the biggest metros. The afternoon highs will lead every broadcast and grab all the attention. But the forecast overnight lows near 80 in the city cores are the danger. That number is why the heat side of this setup is rated so seriously. It was that same number that made Chicago in 1995 so lethal. Those nights refused to cool, and 739 people died. It was that number that made the aftermath of 2012 so deadly. And it is that number sitting quietly under Philadelphia and Washington right now. Let me put this as plainly as I possibly can for you. The frightening headline number is the afternoon high, and it is loud. The number that actually predicts death is the temperature at 3 in the morning. Those two numbers tell completely different stories, and only one is the true one. So look at the bottom of the forecast, not just the top. That is where the honest danger of this whole weekend actually lives. Now put the two clocks together, exactly as they joined in 2012. The heat that makes these nights deadly is feeding the storms on the rim. It is one machine, and the storm is the thing that pulls the trigger. And the trigger works by killing the one machine holding the heat back. Let me answer the obvious question. Why the night and not the day? The daytime high feels like the threat, because it is loud and visible. But the body can take a savage afternoon if the night relents. It is the relentless night that removes the body's only recovery window. There is also a humidity piece that makes these nights worse still. When the air is thick with moisture, sweat cannot evaporate well, and evaporation is the main way your body sheds its heat. So a humid night at 80 degrees is worse than a dry one. The forecast this weekend pairs high overnight lows with heavy, soupy humidity. That pairing is exactly the combination that overwhelms vulnerable bodies fastest. Now watch how neatly the two clocks lock together this weekend. The heat that makes the nights lethal also fuels the storms aloft. It is a single reservoir of energy feeding both threats at once. The heat threatens the body directly through those unrelenting warm nights. The storm threatens the body indirectly by cutting the power that saves it. One machine, two triggers, and the same fragile people underneath both. Keep that picture whole in your mind as we turn next. Because the storm side has a name most people never learned. It is a word invented for a very specific kind of violence, and the story of that word explains just how rare tonight's monster is. Let me tie the threshold back to a real body count. In Chicago, the deadly nights simply refused to fall below the 80s. Over a few days, 739 people died in that heat. The afternoons were brutal, but it was the nights that killed. That is the exact pattern the forecast hints at this weekend. Not a record-shattering afternoon, but a string of merciless nights. So do not let a survivable-looking high number reassure you. Look underneath it, at the low, and count the hot nights in a row. 3 or 4 of those, over a dense city, is the danger. That is the fingerprint I want you watching for all weekend. There is a useful way to picture what the heat is really doing. Think of it as a debt the body takes on each day. A brutal afternoon runs up the balance the body must pay down. The cool of night is when that payment normally gets made. When the night stays hot, the debt rolls over unpaid instead. Day after day, the balance climbs beyond what a frail body can carry. That is why emergency rooms do not fill on the first hot afternoon. They fill a day or two in, as the unpaid debt comes due. The forecast this weekend is a string of days with no payment window, so the danger is not any single afternoon, but the running total. To understand how easily that trigger can fire, you need one strange word. Part 10. The word a forgotten scientist invented in 1888. We have used this strange word all night, and now you deserve its story. The word is Derecho, and it was born right here in the Midwest. A physics professor named Gustavus Hinrichs coined it at the University of Iowa. He published it in the American Meteorological Journal back in 1888. He needed a word for these long, straight, devastating wind events he studied, so he borrowed the Spanish word for straight, or straight ahead. He set it directly against tornado, which comes from the Spanish for turning. Straight against turning, and that single contrast is the whole physical truth. Remember the bulldozer and the corkscrew image from earlier in the story. The corkscrew is the tornado, the bulldozer blade is the derecho. And it is not a label you can slap on any windy storm. To earn the name, a storm must clear a genuinely high bar. Stephen Corfady and his colleagues at the Storm Prediction Center defined that bar. The wind-damaged swath must run more than 250 miles. It must carry gusts of at least 58 miles an hour throughout, and it must include several well-separated gusts above 75 miles an hour. That bar is high, and most severe weather never comes close to it. What builds one is a delicate stack of conditions lining up at once. You need enormous instability, the fuel, which this weekend has in overflowing supply. But fuel alone only gives you ordinary storms that pop and quickly fade. Forecasters call those pulse storms, and they are brief and mostly harmless. To forge a derecho, the storms must lock into a self-sustaining line. That requires the right wind structure through the whole depth of the atmosphere. You need a rear inflow jet, a river of dry air pulled inward. It rushes down to the surface and accelerates the whole line forward. You need the cold pool and the winds aloft to stay balanced. When all of that locks in, the system builds its own momentum. It can then run for half a day across many states. When even one piece is missing, the whole thing collapses into a mess. And that is the crux of the honest read on this weekend. The instability is there, and the fuel could not be more available. But the organising structure, the shear near the big cities, looks weaker. Plenty of gasoline, but not necessarily the engine to build a locomotive. That is a real, physical reason to expect disorganised storms this weekend. It is the single strongest argument against a 2012 repeat tonight. Now let me make sure you can tell the two apart clearly. An ordinary pulse storm is the summer thunderstorm you already know well. It builds in the afternoon heat, dumps rain and dies within an hour. It can knock out power to a neighbourhood, but it stays local. A derecho is what happens when those storms refuse to die at all. This weekend leans far more toward the first kind than the second. The most likely outcome is scattered, disorganised storms along the northern rim. A few could turn locally strong and drop power somewhere for a while, but they probably do not add up to an organised wall of wind. That is the realistic read, and it is a long way from 2012. But derechos are rare unevenly, and that distinction matters for you tonight. This corridor, from the upper Midwest into the mid-Atlantic, breeds them. Most derechos, about 70%, strike in the warm season, May through August. The 2012 monster and the 2020 monster both ran this track. So the rarity is real, and it is genuinely on your side. But it is the rarity of a corridor that is truly capable. Let me give you a fuller sense of how uneven this rarity is. The Storm Prediction Center's own climatology shows a clear derecho corridor. Eastern Iowa and western Illinois see at least one nearly every year. From there, the track bends toward the Ohio Valley and the east. That is the same path both the 2012 and 2020 monsters ran. So these storms are rare across the map but favoured along that line, and that line runs straight through the region under this dome. Return to the engine image, the machine that must build to make one. This weekend has the fuel loaded to the very top of the tank, What it likely lacks is the engine, the wind structure to organise it. Without that engine, the fuel just makes scattered, short-lived pulse storms. Those can still knock out power somewhere for a while tonight, but they rarely add up to a single marching wall of wind. That is the honest science-based reason to lean away from 2012. Not because it is impossible here, but because the engine looks weak. Hold both halves of that, the loaded fuel and the missing engine. It is the most important calibration in this entire forecast tonight, because it means the most likely outcome is serious heat, not a derecho. And yet the one thing that could bridge them still exists. A single strong storm in the wrong place over the wrong city, which is why the next piece, the wire itself, decides everything. Let me give you the exact bar a storm must clear. Corfidi and his colleagues set it out in plain numbers. The damage swath must run more than 250 miles. The winds must reach 58 miles an hour along its length, and it must pack several gusts above 70, 5 miles an hour. Most severe weather never comes anywhere close to all of that. That is why true derechos are the exception, not the rule. It is also why calling this weekend a likely derecho would be dishonest. The bar is high, and the engine to clear it looks weak. Respect the bar, and you will read this forecast correctly. Keep that question alive as we turn toward the thing that decides everything. The wire that decides who lives this weekend. Everything tonight, the heat, the fragile people, the deadly nights, hinges on one thing. That one thing is the power staying on inside these homes. The air conditioner is the most effective heat safety tool ever built. It is why 104 degrees is survivable for most Americans. So the whole weekend comes down to whether the electricity keeps flowing. The Mid-Atlantic corridor that 2012 hit is served by PAM interconnection. PAM coordinates the flow of electricity across 13 states and Washington. It serves on the order of 65 million people every single day. On a weekend like this, it faces the hardest version of its job. When millions all reach for the air conditioning, demand surges toward the ceiling. Grid operators plan for exactly this, all year, with layered defences. On extreme heat days they issue alerts and ask the public to conserve. They line up every available generator to keep supply ahead of demand, and more often than not, they win that fight and hold. That is by far the most likely outcome this weekend too. But here is the specific fragility that 2012 rips wide open. It has almost nothing to do with generating enough power. It is about the wires that deliver that power the last mile. Think of it this way, with a simple plumbing image. Generation is the reservoir, and the wires are the pipes to your house. A heat wave strains the reservoir, pushing demand toward the very top. But a windstorm severs the pipes, and that is a different failure. In 2012, JM had plenty of power available to sell. That was never the problem on that terrible night at all. The problem was 10,000 trees lying across the local lines. No amount of reservoir matters when the pipe to your home is severed. That is the exact way the two clocks collide into one disaster. The heat maxes out demand and makes any outage genuinely deadly. The storm, if it organises, cuts the wire and creates that outage. Neither one alone is 2012, but the crossing point is. And there is one more thing about the wires you must grasp. When a storm shatters the distribution system, restoration is unavoidably slow. Crews cannot simply flip a master switch and bring it back. They must physically clear the fallen trees from every single line. Then they rebuild and reconnect the lines, pole by pole, block by block. Often they do it in the same brutal heat that makes it dangerous. In 2012, that took days for most, and over a week for some. So when I say watch the grid, I do not mainly mean a brownout. I mean the scenario the Derecho wrote for us in blood, A strong storm on the rim, over one hot city, cutting the lines, on a night when the low will not fall below 80 degrees, over neighbourhoods full of exactly the people the heat finds first. That precise chain of events is the whole reason we are here tonight. So keep your eye on that wire, the hinge everything turns on. Let me walk you up the staircase of how a grid operator escalates. On a hot day, PJM starts by issuing simple public alerts. It makes sure every plant that can run is ready to run. If the margin tightens, it calls on reserves and asks for conservation. It asks the public to ease off during the peak evening hours. In the most extreme case, it can order rotating outages deliberately. That last step is rare, and it is not what I expect tonight. But the stage system exists for one very serious reason. An uncontrolled grid collapse is far worse than any single local outage. So the operators guard that margin with real care all summer long. Now return to the reservoir in the pipes one final time. This weekend the demand strains the reservoir, pushing it toward the top. That is the part the operators are built to manage, and usually do. The danger the Derecho exposes is not the reservoir at all. It is a storm severing the pipes the reservoir flows through. When a tree drops a line, no reservoir on Earth helps you. And rebuilding those pipes, span by span, takes days in the heat. So the wire is the true hinge of this entire weekend. Watch for those jum alerts, because they tell you the margin is thinning. And watch the sky on the northern rim, because it holds the spark. The reservoir and the pipes together decide who keeps their cooling. Consider the sheer size of what jum has to hold together. Its territory spans all or part of 13 states and the nation's capital. Roughly 65 million people depend on it every single day. On a peak heat weekend, all of them lean on it at once. The bulk power system is usually strong enough to meet that. The weak point is the last mile, the local poles and lines. Those are the wires a falling tree takes down in seconds. And those are the wires that take days to rebuild by hand. So the fragility is not the reservoir, it is the final pipe. That final pipe is what a storm on the rim threatens. There is a quiet second reason these outages turn so dangerous here. Much of the corridor's local grid is old, and it runs overhead. Overhead lines are cheap and fast, but they live among the trees, so the same aging poles carry the load through the same old canopy. When a storm and a heatwave arrive together, both weaknesses meet. The heat pushes the demand to the ceiling on the aging system. The wind drops the trees onto the exposed lines below them. Neither problem is new, and neither gets fixed before this weekend. So the vulnerability the Derecho exposed in 2012 is still here. It is wired into the poles along these very streets tonight. Now let me line the two summers up directly, honestly, side by side. Part 12. Everything that lines this weekend up with that one. Let me be a fair witness for the frightening side of this first. The similarities between June 2012 and this weekend are real and specific. When you set the two setups side by side, several things line up uncomfortably. Start with the corridor itself. The geography of the whole risk. The 2012 Derecho carved its worst damage through the Ohio Valley eastward. It tore into the Washington and Mid-Atlantic region, the crowded PJM corridor. That is the exact same footprint under the hottest part of this dome. The geography of the danger has not shifted an inch in 14 years. The people, the trees, and the heat sit in the same place. Then look at the pre-existing heat, the piece that made 2012 lethal. That Derecho did not strike on a pleasant 75-degree afternoon. It struck atop a severe, record-flirting heatwave already gripping the east. That preloaded heat is exactly what made the aftermath a killer. This weekend, that same continental heat is already locked firmly in place. The kindling is dry and piled high before any storm has formed. All the setup is missing right now is the single match. Keep picturing that match, because we will come back to it. Now consider the timing, because it is almost eerie to lay out. 2012 struck at the end of June, heading into the 4th. People were travelling, gathering outdoors, distracted, away from the usual news. This weekend is the 4th of July itself, in a crowded year. The country is out on the roads and at the barbecues. Human exposure is at its maximum, and attention is at its minimum. That was not a comforting combination in 2012, and it is not now. Then, the mechanism, which is the same fundamental machine in both cases. Both events are built on the ring of fire structure we walked through. Storms organise on the northern edge of a powerful stationary heat dome. This is not a different species of weather that merely looks similar. It is the same machine, in the same place, over the same people. And there is a fifth similarity that should sober anyone waving this off. It is the forecast humility we spent a whole part on earlier. 2012 taught the field that a loaded atmosphere can outrun the outlook. So did 2020, when the Iowa monster stunned the morning forecasters. That hard lesson is baked into why forecasters watch modest setups closely. So the similarity is not only in the weather patterns themselves, it is in the uncertainty, the humble knowledge that this has fooled experts. If I stopped right here, you would be scared, with real reasons. 5 genuine points of contact between the worst Derecho and this weekend. Same corridor, same preloaded heat, same holiday, same mechanism, same humility. Hold all 5 in your mind for one long, heavy second. Feel how much of the machine is already sitting assembled tonight. And then come with me, because that is only half the truth. Let me press on that match one more time, because it matters. The kindling is dry, the pile is high, the heat is loaded. Everything that made 2012 deadly is sitting here, minus one thing. In 2012 the match was struck, and the pile caught fire. This weekend the match is the storm, and it may never strike, but the pile is real, and it is already stacked over these cities. That is what the 5 similarities really add up to together. Same corridor, same heat, same holiday, same machine, same forecasting humility. None of those 5 is a small or forced connection tonight. Each one is a genuine, verifiable point of contact with that summer. Feel the weight of all 5 sitting together over the same map. It is enough weight that no honest forecaster simply waves it off. It is why this setup earns an hour of your careful attention. And yet, weight is not the same thing as a verdict. A pile of similarities tells you the danger is real and near. It does not tell you the match will actually be struck. For that, you have to look hard at the differences too, and the differences are where the real relief of this weekend lives. So take a breath with me, and let us look at them plainly. Do not underestimate the role the holiday itself plays in this comparison. On a normal Tuesday, people are near their phones and their news. On the 4th of July, they are out and distracted instead. They are travelling, grilling, watching fireworks, far from any forecast. That is exactly when a fast-moving threat catches people flat-footed. 2012 struck into that same holiday inattention 14 years ago. This weekend hands the same setup, the same distracted, crowded audience. So the human exposure is not just large, it is looking away. That is a quiet multiplier on every other similarity we have stacked. It is one more reason this particular map deserves real attention. Layer the crowds of the holiday onto that fragile old grid. Millions are travelling, and millions more are gathered outdoors together. Power demand for cooling peaks exactly when attention is lowest. If an outage struck now, fewer people would notice the early warning. Fewer would move to a cooling centre before the heat turned on them, and more would be far from home, away from their own plans. That is the human geometry that made 2012 so lethal. It is the same geometry sitting over these cities this very weekend. So the holiday is not a footnote to the risk at all. It is a quiet multiplier on every danger we have named. The other half is where the honest answer actually lives. Part 13. Everything that quietly pulls this weekend apart from that one. Now I have to be more honest than most stories like this ever are. Because when you lay the two forecasts side by side, one difference dominates. In 2012, the atmosphere actually produced a high-end organised derecho. This weekend, as of the current outlooks, it is simply not forecast to. That is not a small footnote you can safely skip past. It is the load-bearing wall of this entire comparison tonight. Let me quantify the gap so it is concrete, not just a feeling. The 2012 event, once revealed, sat near the top of the ladder. It was a widespread, violent, self-sustaining wind machine crossing 10 states. This weekend, the Storm Prediction Centre carries a marginal risk broadly. It adds a slight risk in one focused zone up north. That is the bottom of the ladder, the first and second rungs. The centre has not drawn a derecho anywhere on the map. It has not drawn a high-end wind threat over these cities. So on the storm side, the honest truth is the parallel is aspirational. It is the ghost of what such a setup can do at its worst. It is not a description of what this weekend is forecast to do. If you take one thing from tonight, take that exact distinction. Take a breath here, because I am arguing against my own scary opening. There is a second difference, and it lives in the ingredients themselves. Remember, a derecho needs more than the heat and instability we have. It also needs that specific organising wind structure through the atmosphere. It needs the shear and the rear inflow that lock storms into a line. The current reads near the big eastern cities suggest that structure is weak. Abundant fuel, but a questionable engine to turn it into a monster. That is a meaningful physical reason to expect disorganised storms instead. The atmosphere may well hand us gasoline with no real spark. So the most likely version of this weekend is not 2012. It is a hot, hard holiday with scattered storms and local outages. That is the honest base case, and I will not inflate it. But the base case is not the only case worth watching. The tail risk, the small chance of organisation, is exactly why we watch. And even the base case carries the heat, which is danger enough. So do not mistake, probably not for a promise of nothing. Hold that distinction, because the honest answer depends on it entirely. There is one more difference though, and it is not about the sky. It is about us, and about how much has changed since then. Let me sharpen the gap between the two summers even further. In 2012, the atmosphere had the shear to organise a line. The storms locked together and marched as one for hundreds of miles. This weekend, the reads near the big cities show that shear is weak. Without it, storms fire and fade rather than joining into a wall. That is the difference between a headline and a forgettable footnote. Think again about the vapour in the room from earlier tonight. 2012 had both the vapour and the spark in one place. This weekend has the vapour, but the spark looks unlikely to catch. That is a real physical reason for genuine, measured relief. But I will not oversell that relief, because two dangers remain. The first is the tail risk, the small chance the engine builds anyway. Loaded setups have surprised the experts before, in 12 and in 20. The second danger does not need any storm at all. The heat itself is already here, and it is already serious. So probably not a Derecho does not mean probably nothing this weekend. It means the most likely harm comes from the heat, not the wind. Hold that carefully, because it is the pivot of the whole answer. The storm is the unlikely tail, the heat is the certain base. And one more difference, the biggest of all, is not in the sky. Let me put the risk levels on a simple ladder for you. The severe outlook runs 5 rungs, from marginal up to high. 2012, once organised, was operating near the top rungs. This weekend sits on the first and second rungs only. That is not a subtle difference in wording, it is enormous. It is the difference between a footnote and a landmark disaster. So when the storm side of this parallel tempts you toward panic, remember the ladder. We are near the bottom of it, and that is the honest truth. The heat is the real story, and the storm is the unlikely tale. Keep those in proportion, because proportion is what honesty requires here. Let me translate that word shear into something you can picture. Shear is a change in wind speed or direction with height. Storms need the right amount of it to organise and survive. Too little, and a storm rains into its own cold air and dies. That is a pulse storm, loud for an hour and then gone. The right kind of shear lets storms tilt, breathe, and sustain themselves. That is what lets a cluster become a marching line of wind. This weekend, over the eastern cities, that organising shear looks thin. So the storms have the heat to grow, but not to hold together. On radar, that is the difference between a blob and a wall. That difference is big enough to deserve its own part next. Part 14. The one thing that changed since that summer. The last difference is not in the atmosphere at all. It is in us, and in the 14 years since 2012. The human systems that respond to this exact threat have genuinely improved. Consider the heat warnings putting 165 million people on notice. That heat risk system did not exist in its current national form then. Heat is taken far more seriously now as the quiet killer it is. Much of that came from studying disasters exactly like the ones tonight. Cities across this corridor now run cooling centre networks during dangerous heat. They run wellness check programs for isolated and vulnerable residents in the worst zones. They run heat action plans sharpened by the hard lessons of past events. Remember Klinenberg's finding that isolation in 1995 became death. Those check-in programs exist precisely to break that deadly isolation now. The grid operators also have more tools and more hard experience today. They manage extreme demand with better data than they had in 2012. None of that makes anyone bulletproof, and I would never claim it does. But it does mean a response would likely be faster and better organised. It would likely be better than the one that failed those 34 people. So the differences genuinely cut in your favour, and I will not hide them. I want you to feel both edges of this, because both are true. But there is a counterweight, and honesty demands I name it too. The broader backdrop these events unfold against has clearly shifted warmer. Summers across much of the country have trended hotter over recent decades. The prolonged high overnight low heat wave that does the real killing is more common. That does not tell you whether this weekend produces a storm at all. And it is not a doomsday claim about this specific holiday, but it is the honest context around the true danger here. The response systems have improved, which genuinely helps protect you. The underlying heat has, on average, grown a little more serious, so the picture is mixed, and the honest read holds both halves. The humans got better at this, and the heat got a little worse. Hold both of those, because the final answer needs them together. Now we have walked every piece of this, the heat and the storm. We have walked the history, the science, the grid, and the gaps. So it is time to ask the question we opened with plainly. Let me give that improvement the weight it honestly deserves. In 2012, no national heat risk map warned the public this clearly. Today, that system flags danger days for 165 million people. That is a real tool that did not exist in that summer. Cities now open cooling centres before the worst heat even arrives. They run wellness checks aimed straight at the isolated and the frail. Those programs exist because of what Klinenberg found in Chicago's morgues. Isolation became death in 1995, and the checks fight that directly. The grid operators, too, have far more experience with extreme demand now. They plan for these weekends with better data than they once had. None of that makes anyone bulletproof against a bad enough outage. But it does tilt the odds toward a faster, better response. So the human side of this comparison has genuinely improved since then. And I want you to hold that as real earned reassurance tonight. But honesty cuts both ways, so hear the counterweight as well. The summers themselves have trended hotter across much of the country. The long, high overnight low heat waves that kill are growing more common. That does not tell us what this single weekend will do, but it means the underlying heat is a bit more dangerous now. Better response systems and a hotter baseline, both true at once. Carry both of those into the answer we are about to reach. Here is the sharpest way to see the improvement since then. In 2012, the cooling centres opened after the grid had failed. Today, the plan is to open them before the heat even peaks. In 2012, no one was systematically knocking on isolated doors. Today, those wellness checks are written into city heat plans. That shift is small on paper, but large in lives saved. It is the direct answer to what Klinenberg found in the morgues. And it is the reason a repeat, even of the heat, would likely be gentler. But do not let that lull you into ignoring the nights ahead. Better plans still depend on someone actually checking the door. There is one more piece of progress worth naming plainly. Heat is now warned like the serious hazard it always was. The heat risk map uses colours that climb from yellow to deep magenta. Magenta means extreme rare heat that endangers anyone without cooling. That kind of blunt, impact-based warning did not exist in 2012. It tells people the truth about a night, not just an afternoon. So the public today has a clearer picture than it once did. But a warning only works if someone acts on it. The map can turn magenta and still not reach the woman upstairs. That gap between the warning and the door is where lives are still lost. And it is time, at last, to answer it as honestly as I can. Part 15. So do these cities really live through all of it again? So here is the question, one final time, clean and direct. If a storm kills the power over one of these cities this weekend, what then? Do these streets live through June of 2012 all over again? Here is the honest answer, calibrated to the data and nothing else. Probably not, at least not the full 2012, not the historic version. The specific thing that made that summer a disaster is not forecast. A high-end, organised, long-track derecho is not what the outlooks describe. The storm threat sits at the bottom two rungs of the ladder. The organising ingredients near these cities look genuinely limited tonight, and the professional forecasters have not drawn anything close to a derecho. If you are asking me to bet, I will place that bet. This weekend probably does not produce a 2012 scale windstorm here. That is the most likely outcome by a wide margin. But do not exhale all the way, because the answer has a second half. Two of the three pieces that made 2012 lethal are already here. The heat is real, continental, and the deadly overnight lows are forecast now. And the vulnerable people who die in these events are already here too. The only missing piece is the trigger, the storm-driven outage. A continental derecho this weekend is genuinely unlikely, and that is the truth. But one strong storm cutting the power over one hot city is not exotic. It happens somewhere in this country most summer weekends without much notice. What makes it dangerous this weekend is the heat it would land in. Remember the 91-mile-an-hour gust and the 4 million dark homes. Remember that the wind killed 13 and the silence killed 34 more. That silence, the powerless heat, is the real ghost of 2012. It is already half assembled over these cities as you watch tonight. So watch the number at the bottom of the forecast this weekend. Watch whether the overnight lows refuse to fall below 80 degrees. Watch whether that marginal risk climbs as the holiday actually arrives. And check on the neighbour who lives alone, who has no cooling. In every one of these disasters, a single knock has saved a life. The storm may never come, and I hope it never does. But the heat is already here, and the weekend is not over. The last word does not belong to the afternoon high on the map. So watch that number over the next 3 days with me. Watch whether the overnight lows refuse to break 80 degrees. Watch whether the humidity keeps the nights thick and airless. Watch whether that marginal risk climbs as the holiday actually arrives. Any one of those is the setup speaking a little louder. And if you take nothing else, take this one simple act. Find the person near you who is old, or sick, or alone. Knock on the door, and make sure the heat is not winning. In every disaster we have walked through, that knock saved lives. The storm may pass these cities by entirely this weekend. The heat will not, because it is already sitting over them. It belongs to the temperature in a dark room at 3 in the morning. So here is what to actually watch over the next 3 days. Watch the overnight low, and count the nights it stays near 80. Watch the humidity, because thick air makes every one of those nights worse. Watch whether that marginal risk creeps upward as the holiday arrives. And watch the alerts from the grid, because they reveal a thinning margin. Think back to that 91-mile-an-hour gust and those 4 million dark homes. The wind that night was loud, and the silence afterward was louder. That silence is the part of 2012 that could return. Not as a monster on the map, but as a quiet, powerless heat. The kind that finds the people no camera is pointed at. Tell me in the comments whether you think these cities get lucky. I will be reading every single one of them tonight. Stay cool, drink more water than you think, and watch that number.